Remember how I talked to you a bit about how the room was designed to be a geography and also a sort of history lesson? So the first place that you see when you enter into the room is the classical stuff that is actually the schema or main plan for any other work of art that comes after it. So you go into the classical heart of it, and in that classical heart on the left-hand side are the smaller or lesser objects that are from the ancient Greek world, which are the pottery. And they put the most important ones, which are the sculptures, sort of almost as greeters at the doorway when you walk in there and you pass by these sculptures and you enter in. You see on the left-hand side is a bunch of pottery in cases. And I think a lot of people tend to walk past that stuff. And I think that the pottery itself in some ways is more interesting than the big sculptures that we looked at before. So let's go in and take a look at some of the cases. And the cases usually contain small fragments of what I would consider to be almost inferior sort of archaeological finds. And that doesn't mean that they're really, in terms of their value to us, they're inferior, though. They're things that people could afford who were sort of lower income millionaires and really wealthy people. So these little fragments relate to other things that we're going to be looking at and talking about. Okay. The pottery collection that they have there, I think, is actually pretty outstanding. They don't have, for instance, Ezekias or Andokides, which are some of the potters that we're going to be studying, but they do have an awful lot of really good examples of the main forms of pottery, which are geometric, black figure, red figure, and polychromed pottery. They also have some cool little things like, for instance, this little statue of a wet drapery figure standing in contrapposto. That's pretty neat, just to be able to see something like that from the ancient world. And you'll see how that relates to sculpture during the golden age of Pericles. You've already seen some examples of it when we talked about the facade of the building. We move around the room and take a look at the scope of it, and we're going to go and study specifically the cases of pottery on the right-hand side. This pot is one of my favorite things there because I had just learned about the differences in phases of pottery. So I'm going to try to lay that out and make that a little bit more clear for you. And we'll be looking at a video that explains the phases that pottery goes through.
So for my students, one of the things that I try to do is I try to give them a timeline of what to study and how to study it and what the name or period names are. And you can visit my site if you want to get this off of there, and you can figure out what the passwords are if you actually look at the syllabi there in the passwords. So if you want to get in there and take a look at that stuff. But again, I want to comment that if you're looking at this and you're using these dates, other teachers might not be into it, okay? So if you look at this timeline, one of the things that I'm trying to point out is that a lot of the cultures are grouped around the same time periods, and a lot of geographic regions are grouped around the same time periods. So an interesting kind of undetail is the Cyclades are around 2500, and that's contemporaneous with the building of the pyramids. The Minoan culture at Crete is 1500, so are the mainland. And then we're going to move into some later works of art. So when we looked at Lefkandi, the site was about 1000, but the artworks sort of looked geometric or proto-geometric, and there are some substyles of pottery that we're going to be studying that exist in Aegean art, specifically on the mainland in the Helladic cultures, and that's what we're going to be studying next. And so the question is, why bother with pottery? Okay, well, if you look at my pottery from my house, you'll see with my cute little Ernie cup, I have a series of pots that I know, these vessels, what is specifically in each one. And so I know what to find in each one of these vessels in order to get what I want to eat and what is appropriate for each thing. Now, the other thing about, for instance, my pottery or vessels is that they communicate some things about the kinds of things I'm into personally, but also what the culture is into, right? So when you study pottery, pottery is sometimes considered a low art. It's not high art. It's a popular art. It's popular culture. And so the imagery on it often communicates exactly what the culture believed in and what kinds of values they had. Ancient Greek vessels all have names that are specifically about what each vessel was used for. So for instance, the amphora means to carry, and it has two handles on it. You have a Panathenaic amphora, which is basically a kind of form in which you have, it's an amphora, two handles on it, but it has, all of Athens used it. Pan, meaning all, Athenaic means Athens. Hydria, water, oinokoi means, I think, to pour out. A crater is a big vessel that's used to have mixed wine and water in, and of course the bell crater looks like a bell. Calyx crater or Kylix crater looks almost like a cross between one of their drinking cups, which is a Kylix, and then you have these other little vessels, you know, that are used to pour things out and that kind of thing. So the decorations on pottery, for instance, this plate tells you something about America. You know, we value country scenes, and we value landscape and plants and animals and that kind of thing. And you could go a little bit deeper. It's kind of a kitsch kind of plate with a country kind of theme on it. It's got these wheels on it with a waterfall, and all of those things relate to the good old-fashioned values, sort of like Little House on the Prairie. That's what this plate kind of represents, at least to me. And maybe if an archaeologist dug through my house, they would think the same kinds of things. So for archaeologists and art historians, a main thing to know is what the vessels hold and what they represent. And that way you'll know on a test, if you know that something that has two handles, it's an amphora. If you know that it has, it's a sort of shallow bowl that we see represented here, that's a kylix. I've also heard it pronounced calyx. And that means to roll out, and that's from the use of the potter's wheel. And then the oinokoi is basically a pitcher or a vessel that pours things out. So we know specifically those are the main kinds of vessels that we're going to look at, and they become a standard kind of form, almost like jelly jars and Tabasco jars and things like that. The first period we're going to be studying is the geometric period, and it goes from about 900 to 700, and if you looked at that timeline before, it does overlap with the sculpture style that is archaic style sculpture or archaic period. And so when you're studying art history, sometimes periods and styles are one and the same thing, and art historians use that interchangeably. This crater is actually one that was found in Athens in the cemetery, in the Dipleon cemetery, but it now lives in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. And so when my wife and I, here she is on the right-hand side, is posing next to it to give you a sense of scale, we got to see this. And it was one of those things I was so excited when I was studying art history and I got to see this the first time. And it's called geometric because it's stylized in a geometric way. So let's look at it first from a formal point of view and then discuss the iconography or symbolism on the vase afterwards. From a formal point of view, this is a pretty big vase. It's humongous. It's made out of terracotta, and it was glazed with engobe or slip, which is just a dark glaze that would have darkened or oxidized in the heat of a kiln. The size, although it's massive, it's completely decorated, and probably the way that this was decorated was it was placed on a wheel so that, for instance, those long horizontal lines that you're looking at could have been actually just, the potter just holds the brush in one spot and then just spins the wheel and puts the glaze on it in that single swoop that runs around it. It's organized or divided up into a series of frets or horizontal bands, and that's important because every single section of this is filled up, and the horizontal bands actually contain decorative motifs and stories. If we zoom in on some of the areas, you'll see that they leave no space untouched. And again, that term for that, the art historical term for that, is horror vacui, which means a fear of empty spaces. the figures themselves and all of the ornamentation in it are completely stylized in a geometric way, and they look a little bit like those Cycladic figures that we saw from the Cycladic Islands, and they are not very naturalistic. Now, look at the date. It's 750 BCE, and the Minoan culture, for instance, the Vafio cups and other things we looked at, are really 1500 BCE. So what happened? Why is this more stylized? Well, it's a different culture, it's a different time period, and they have different ideas and values. And in this instance, it was more about communicating clearly the themes on the vessel and what it was used for. So let's go into context slightly. The context that this was found in was a cemetery, and this might have been placed on top of a grave. I understand that there are actually holes in the base of it, and the holes were described by my professor Herbert Broderick that they could have been drainage holes, or they could have been that you put libations, like for instance pour wine in it, and then the wine trickles down through the bottom of the vase into the grave. And this relates somewhat to scenes out of the Odyssey where they bring libations of blood, or you can pour wine on someone's grave to sort of feed them after they're dead. So we know that this is a grave marker. It's sort of a tombstone. And when we zoom in on the central section of this, you can actually see there are people surrounding a funeral bier. I think bier is spelled B-I-E-R in this instance. And there's a man sitting on the funeral bier, and you can tell that it's a male because he has a penis coming out of the side of his thigh. And then you can see the mother and son in various locations on this. One is they're seated. The other one is that they're on the funeral bier themselves. And then underneath the funeral bier is actually a series of animals and ducks and birds and things like that. And those probably were to be buried with him. I understand, I think that they burnt the bodies, but I'm not completely sure about this. On either side of the funeral bier, what you see are these figures with their hands above their heads. They're actually women pulling out their hair. So they are mourning the death of this hero who was buried in this cemetery. And that's a standard iconography or a standard read of this kind of symbols or iconography. The vessel is, you can walk completely around it, and it's an amphora. It has several handles. It's not officially an amphora because it has two handles. It's actually, the design is called a crater, but you can actually see in the bottom registers, there's actually a parade for the fallen hero as well. So when you zoom in on that, you can actually see some of the figures are chariots with soldiers who are carrying shields on them as well. That iconography is fairly consistent, and you can see that another vase found from the same time period in the same cemetery yields the same kind of completely decorated horror vacui divided up into frets. This one doesn't have the funeral procession or the parade in honor of the person, but it does have a central panel. And the central panel we're looking at has the same theme on it. It has the funeral bier, it has the people pulling their hair out, it has people surrounding this person, and it also has the same design of what's called a Greek key above it, which is that sort of weird spiraling pattern that you're going to see on buildings later on. So if we go down the vase, you can actually see a lot of the patterns are repeated over and over again, that it's a way of just filling in the form. And I think that for a lot of cultures, the idea of decorating something and really having it almost over-the-top decoration is a way of showing extra work and extra attention to the work. And in that way, the decorative qualities of these geometric forms and the horror vacui is a way of also showing that this is a prestige item. It's an item worth a lot. It's something that's valuable by all the work that went into it. Now, there's a shift from the geometric period or geometricizing style, which is basically the forms are in black figures that are painted almost as silhouettes on a vase. And then we have a little shift into what's called the Orientalizing period. And we're looking at an oinokoi, which is just basically a wine pitcher. And you can see it almost seems like it's influenced a little bit by the artwork that we saw, for instance, in Mesopotamia. It has these sort of griffin lions on it. It almost looks Egyptian too, some of the forms on it. We have little swastika designs on it. What distinguishes this vase from the geometric style vase that we're looking at on the right hand side probably is that the figures are very curvilinear. They're naturalistic in some ways. They're still cartoons. There's no deep space, and they still kind of have that horror vacui with these little doodads or medallions that are floating around them. But we have a figure that is flowing a little bit more. And the other thing is, it's a little bit like, for instance, Asian art, where we have this line and fill pattern that we saw, for instance, in the earlier banners we looked at, from Lady Di's banner and the other banner of the magician flying into the sky. We've got an outline, which is a contour line that outlines it, and then fill in of the color. And so these aren't strictly black figures anymore. They're actually kind of outlined figures, and there are different colors of glaze. In the bottom register, what we see is actually plants that look like they are Egyptian in origin, and I think that those are either papyrus or lotus blossoms in the bottom register, which also indicates that it's orientalized. And when we talked about orientalizing styles, it's basically a cheesy term that art historians came up with to describe anything that looks like it's influenced by something from the East. And in this instance, it would be something that's influenced by the Eastern culture of the Egyptians. Now, the last thing about the iconography, we have a griffin, which is a chimera, which is a composite or compound creature of a lion and an eagle. And then in the second middle register, we have another hunting scene that relates to the scene that we saw from Tyrene's and also from the flotilla fresco of the Aegean Sea from Thera, in which you have a hunting scene, which is a sort of standard kind of theme in a lot of artwork, this hunting scene. There's an evolution in the Orientalizing period that also starts to show human figures or anthropomorphic figures a little bit more realistically. And this vase, I've heard it called a whole bunch of different things. In most textbooks, they call it the Blinding of Polyphemus and Gorgons. I've also once or twice heard it called the Ulysses vase, and was found at a place called Eleusis. And so I think the Eleusis amphora. And what is really significant for me is that there's actually an artist associated with it, and the artist's name is Menelaus. And so we actually have a real artist who signed their work, and that also means that people are starting to become literate, and they're taking pride, and there's a rise in individuality. And we haven't actually seen this since Thutmose in Egypt, where we actually know the name of the artist. So you can see it's done in a very similar style. Again, it's divided up into frets and bands, kind of like the oinokoi on the left. We also have a series of successive stories. In the middle register, there's a hunting scene with a series of boars fighting. And then the top and bottom levels actually depict different stories. The top level is a story out of the story of the Odyssey, which is it's actually when Ulysses or Odysseus is returning home and he has to blind the Cyclops. The bottom register actually is a depiction of a scene from a story concerning Perseus and the Gorgons. So zooming in on this, we see, first of all, that there is, again, horror vacui, and they're putting these sort of weird little medallions and doodads in areas between the figures. But most significantly, it shows a story. And you know how kids have a hero lunchbox that depicts, for instance, Batman or Superman, or if it's a female, it's some other characters that they're into. Well, this is kind of what the Greeks were into and the stories that they were into. So, for instance, the story of Odysseus is that he is trying to get back home, and he spends many years trying to return home. And at one point, he ends up on an island. And the island is an island that contains this giant creature that has only one eye. And that is a metaphor for actually people who are not hospitable and people who are not human. And this sort of creature that is the offspring of Poseidon and someone else, I can't remember who at the moment, he has this cave. And the laws or rules of hospitality are that if someone is lost and traveling, you want to make them your friend, you want to make them your buddies. So you greet them with open arms and you give them food and shelter. Well, Odysseus assumes that that's going to be the case. He ends up in this cave and he doesn't really understand that the Cyclops lives there. And then the Cyclops comes in and rolls a stone in front of the door. And he's so big that Odysseus's crew can't move the stone. And so the Cyclops starts eating them, and in a nutshell, Odysseus steps up and introduces himself to the Cyclops and says, if you eat me, you'll eat all the magic in my brains, in my head, and you won't have learned anything. And so he convinces the Cyclops to have a drink with him, and they pour out wine, and Cyclops has never had wine before, and the Cyclops gets drunk. And when he's passed out, Odysseus takes a spear, more or less, and jams it into the eye of the Cyclops. And that's what this scene depicts. He got the Cyclops drunk, he blinds him, and then what they do to get out of the cave is actually the men either attach themselves to the bodies of sheep underneath, they crawl underneath, or they also put on sheepskin, and when the Cyclops rolls back the stone, they sneak out of the cave underneath the sheep or underneath sheepskin to escape the Cyclops. And Odysseus introduces himself to the Cyclops. His name is No Body. And so when the Cyclops starts to yell for his brothers, he says, he blinded me, he blinded me. And they go, who blinded you? He says, nobody blinded me. And so, of course, they escape. And so this is one of those episodes. And I think the most important component of this is that it shows a hero who also uses his brains. He's intelligent. And that was one of the qualities that would have been important in Greek armies. And the ancient Greeks actually prized intellectuality and cleverness. And a lot of the stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey express those kinds of ideas. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is that this is a transference of cultural stories and transference of cultural values, but it also shows an evolution in formal kinds of components. We see here that there's an outline kind of effect going on, and that the figures are not black figured silhouettes completely, that there is white glaze being used in certain areas of this vase as well. In the register below, you actually see a sort of hunting scene, a boar scene, where these animals are fighting, and that relates to other scenes that we've seen on other vases and other frescoes from the Minoan period. Then in the bottom register, you see these sort of weird creatures, and these creatures have snakes for hair. I guess they needed some really good cream rinse. And the story that's probably depicted on this, if you look on the right-hand side, you can see some legs walking away, is the story of Perseus and the Gorgons. And more or less the story is this, that the Gorgons were so ugly that if you looked on them, they would turn to stone, and Perseus is fighting another army. And so what he does is he actually cuts the head off of one of these Gorgons who has snakes for hair, and then puts it in a sack, and then he instructs his men not to look. And so when his men actually are fighting this army, at one point he gives a signal, they all avert their eyes. Perseus stands up there with this head of the Gorgon and turns the opposing army into stone. Now you're probably wondering, well, how did he cut the head off, right? Because if he looked at it, it would turn to stone. The way he did it was he shined up a shield, and he looked into the shield, and he saw a distorted reflection which didn't turn him to stone. And so I think that, again, this is a hero who's using intellect over strength, and it kind of relates somewhat to the idea of the centaur, that the brain and the intellect are prime to becoming a hero, and that physical strength are a secondary concern. And I think that's something that we can learn from in our own culture.